So welcome, folks. As people join us, we'll give people another minute or so to enter. For those just joining us, we'll get started in about, another minute or so. But welcome, everyone, to our panel on trans and non-binary resilience, resistance, and self-reliance. My name is Jenny Beeman. I use they, them pronouns. I am the director of the UMass Stonewall Center. I am also associate editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia of LGBTQ plus studies that was put out by SAGE. This event is sponsored by the Stonewall Center and by SAGE to mark the publication of the encyclopedia. Everyone who registered will get not only a recording of this session, but 18 encyclopedia entries written by everyone here and an extensive resource list. If you did not attend the previous SAGE encyclopedia panel we did on LGBTQ plus youth in schools, that is available on YouTube, and I will share a link to that in the chat in a moment or two. This will also be put on YouTube after today for people to be able to access. The format for tonight is I will ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and then ask them a series of questions. After that, it is your turn. I'll open it up to questions from attendees. You can leave questions for individuals or for the panel as a whole under the Q&A function. And the panelists will use the chat to leave links and resources, so please check there as we go along. So to get started, let me first have Abby introduce herself, who is our wonderful editor of the SAGE Encyclopedia.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the event today. I'm really excited that you're all here. And yeah, I'm Abby Goldberg. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at Clark University, also an affiliated scholar with the Williams Institute, the editor of the SAGE Encyclopedia of LGBT Studies, and also one of the editors with Jenny of the Encyclopedia of Trans Studies. So thank you.
When I'm on around my screen, Jennifer, you want to go next?
Hi, my name's Jennifer McGuire. I'm a professor and an extension specialist at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. And my background and research area are predominantly on young people who identify as queer or trans. And I tend to focus on things within the context that support positive development, like schools, families, sports participation. Thanks.
Sergio?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sergio Dominguez, or Sergio Dominguez. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a doctoral candidate in counseling psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm also a doctoral intern in health service psychology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I think some of my work really focuses on talking to other providers, including psychologists, regarding how to best care for trans and non-binary folks. Some other of my research focuses on both experiences of oppression as well as experiences of joy and of resistance that trans folks experience. Particularly, my dissertation is about multiply marginalized trans people's experiences of gender euphoria. And I am so honored and excited to be here. And I also find myself quite nervous. I haven't done one of these webinars in quite a while. So thank you all for being receptive to my nervousness. And I'm really excited and honored to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. Jody?
Hi everyone, my name is Jody Herman. My pronouns are she and hers. I am a senior scholar at the Williams Institute, where I've been since fall of 2010. And I'm also the co-principal and investigator on the US Trans Survey. I focus primarily on the trans and non-binary population in the US, demographics, characteristics, experiences of discrimination, and impacts of discrimination. The US Trans Survey data set, for instance, is focused on looking at experiences of discrimination and impact. And so that's my primary focus. I'm super happy to be here with you all tonight. And thanks, Jenny, for having me.
Paz?
Hello, everyone. I'm Paz Galupo. I use they and she pronouns. I'm super excited to be here with all of the panelists and moderators and all of you. I am currently the Audre Lorde Distinguished Professor of Sexual Health and Education at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis. After being a professor at Towson University in Maryland for 27 years. I actually retired from that position to get to come to St. Louis and the Midwest to do this work. My research really in the last 10 years is focused mostly on trans and non-binary folks. And I'm finding that the way in which I'm researching and thinking about gender minority stress, and especially resilience and joy, has shifted a lot as I've moved from Maryland to Missouri. And I'm really excited about that and feel really privileged that I was able to take a position in the Midwest at a time when many trans and non-binary folks are leaving this state, that I have enough protection to feel like this was a good move for me and for my career, and I have the resources to do this type of work, to specifically focus on trans and non-binary folks in a state that is not so welcoming. So I'm excited to discuss and hear about everybody else's experiences.
And then Annalise.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Abby. It's awesome to be here. My name is Annalise Singh. I use she and they pronouns. Right now, I'm serving as Chief Diversity Officer, and I'm a professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. I know many of you have been here, but you may not know the Choctaw word for New Orleans was Bulbancha. So kind of put that in your the back of your mind. The South has always been very indigenous, very Black, very Latinx, very Middle Eastern, very Asian. conversation. And I think that feels really important to call into the room as I talk about my research and advocacy. The majority of my research has been with trans and non-binary communities, exploring resilience, not your everyday, oops, I spilled my coffee, but resilience as resistance. I've always studied it that way. And in terms of trans liberation, specifically as it relates to counseling and psychological practice, mostly with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and young folks. I was in Georgia, as Paz was sharing. I was like, yeah, I was in Georgia for like 30 years. 13 of those years, I was in Atlanta at the University of Georgia. I commuted, that's another story, but founded the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition along with other comrades to really work at the intersections of racism, sexism, and other intersectional oppressions. My research most recently has been through Project Affirm, which is a longitudinal grant exploring trans risk, resilience, identity development, cardiovascular health in Atlanta, New York, and San Francisco. So we've been following a cohort of about 330 people for, I can't believe it's been almost 10 years. And we're about to build a Bulbancha, New Orleans cohort. So thank you all. I do identify as someone from the South, proudly for what the South can be, a South Asian, mixed race, queer, genderqueer, femme person. So look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Such an amazing panel of people. I think we are so blessed to have you all here tonight. So thank you all again for taking the time to be part of this. So my first question is just to sort of set the stage. What does the landscape look like right now across the US for trans and non-binary people, particularly youth? And what do you see happening in the next few years at the state level and in courts? And I think we'll start with Jody.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm obviously having I work at a research center that focuses on law and policy. So I'm always looking kind of at the policy situation. But the policy situation has direct impacts on people's lives, both as a direct result of the statutes that are enacted, but also in the debates that go swirl around. So what what we're seeing is that trans people, youth in particular, have been the focus of a lot of state legislation in the past few years. So in 2023, over 500 pieces of legislation were introduced at the state level regarding LGBTQ plus people, and a large segment of that is targeted at trans youth in particular. So someone decided that the best politics of the day are to try to restrict trans people's rights and freedoms and access to care, and that you saw it percolating kind of in 2016 with HB2 in North Carolina, and then since then it's been like the floodgates have opened. So I think it's a political move. I also think it's a backlash move. There's a lot of ways to analyze that whole situation, but here's where we are. So for trans youth, the topics that are in focus are about denying access to gender affirming care. They're about denying access to participation in sports. They're about accessing bathrooms and other facilities. I thought that whole bathroom debate, we had tried to shut it down back in 2016, but it didn't. Apparently it keeps coming back up. I sometimes feel like we're playing whack-a-mole with these policies that keep popping up, and we have to fight against them. But pronoun use, so using gender affirming pronouns in schools is actually debated in the legislatures, and required disclosure of trans status from students, requiring schools to disclose to parents if their child wants to use a different pronoun or comes out as transgender. So there's a lot going on. But I do want to say that there are states that are actually working to protect trans youth and enacting laws that aim to protect access to gender affirming care, and are enacting bans on conversion therapy, for instance. So there's good going on at the same time, but I think that kind of gets lost when we look at the wave of really negative legislation happening. And in terms of the courts, you know, there's a lot of activity going on. Bans on gender affirming care have actually been blocked by the courts in Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, and Montana, while those cases move through the court system. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity in the courts coming up. You know, these statutes might get enacted, but that doesn't mean that people can't fight back against them and use the court system to try to, you know, keep the rights that we should all have, right? So I talked about impacts, like the swirling debates that go on. So back in February, we released some preliminary findings from the 2022 U.S. Trans Survey. And we found that nearly half of our respondents had thought about leaving their state because of bad state laws. And this is a sample of over 92,000 trans people across the United States. So nearly half thought about leaving, and 5% actually moved from their states. Now, granted, that was 2022. And so the wave of legislation has only gotten worse since then. So I would imagine if we were to do that survey again right now, those numbers would have shifted. That's just my assumption. So people are actually leaving their homes over these state laws. And we see from prior research that policy debates like these can really negatively impact not only people directly from the result of the statute, like not able to participate in sports, but can negatively impact mental health. So, you know, there was a study that was done around Prop 8 in California that found that LGBTQ youth in schools, as a result of the debates around Prop 8, were actually experiencing increased homophobic bullying against them in schools. And I think with some of the stories that we're hearing about how trans kids and non-binary kids are being treated in schools around the country, that there's potentially an increase in bullying as a result of these policy debates that take place. There's, you know, evidence to support that that's probably going on right now. So, yeah, so there's an immediate impact of the statutes, but then there's also indirect impacts as a result of the debates. And, you know, with that, I'll stop there, and, you know, I'd happy to discuss any of that further.
I put the NCTE preliminary findings into the chat. If you want to put the California study that you cited as well, that'd be great if you get a chance.
Oh yeah, I can find that.
Yeah. Paz, you wanted to weigh in on this question as well?
Yeah, sure. I think the one thing that really strikes me, and I really appreciated how Jody talked about this as being really strategic. And I think that it's not only strategic because it's the time and there's momentum kind of behind it, but I also think it's really intersectionally strategic in some ways. And I think we need to really think about that. So for example, Senate Bill 49, which recently passed and was enacted in Missouri, which is banning gender affirmative care for youth, is proposed as if it's, you know, trying to keep youth safe in some ways from experimentation. But if you actually look at the other things that are proposed in that bill, it's also restricting gender affirmative care for those low income folks or folks on Medicaid or Medicare. Also restricts gender affirmative care for individuals who are incarcerated. And so that's not often talked about, but if you see how it's being attached in certain ways, other vulnerable groups, even of trans and non-binary adults, are being attached, which we're not often talking about. So I think that the legislation is intentionally intersectional in a way that our response often is not. And so I think that, and I think they're counting on that in some ways, that we see this as just these very isolated issues that are coming up. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, we really need to be thinking in much more intersectional ways as we're thinking about how to respond to this legislation. The other thing that really comes up for me too, because I've recently made the move. So I was in Maryland, where I just finished a statewide assessment of trans and non-binary Marylanders. And one of the things when we were devising that, we were doing it around legislation that was happening in Maryland. So we were thinking about how are trans and non-binary folks being positively impacted by policies we were putting in place. So we were getting the gender X marker, and we were looking, and it was kind of a nice way to do research and think about what are the positive things that are happening about this. And moving to Missouri and thinking about how do I also look at the impact of these policies. Obviously, we're not looking at any positive policies. We're really thinking about how are things kind of being restricted. One of the things that I have had a pulse on doing research kind of in both places is that there's a lot of complacency, I think, in a lot of the other states comparatively, where they're like, oh yeah, that's just happening in the Midwest, and that's not really going to come here. But when you really look at what's also being proposed in Maryland, they're seeing that it's working in some of these other states, and they're testing whether or not they can get some of those those opposing laws also passed there. So Missouri might be seen as kind of a state where they try to test out a lot of negative policy, but once it passes, other legislators take that and try to pass it in other states where there hadn't been opposing or restrictive legislation otherwise. So I do feel like it's incredibly strategic. One of the things that's actually really refreshing about being in Missouri, doing this kind of work, if there has to be a silver lining, is that it's people here are really, really mobilized and doing really creative things. And so I feel like one of the things that we also need to do is work across states, think about the strategies that different individuals are kind of crafting across this legislation and work together much more systematically, because that's what they're doing with the legislation. And I think sometimes we're not nearly as strategic and or intersectional in our approach.
Very much so, I think. My next question is the following. We mostly hear about the oppression that trans and non-binary youth face and the negative effects this causes. That's real, but it's not the full story. From your research advocacy, how do you see trans and non-binary young people showing resilience and resisting the oppression that they encounter? And I think Sergio's going to start this one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for this question. And I'm really, really excited to talk about this one because I think that something that can often be missed when we're having these conversations is just the ways that youth are so unbelievably brilliant and so unbelievably aware and so unbelievably capable of resisting all the things that like us as adults end up like throwing at the youth. They're able to say like, nope, I'm able to like just, finesse the system and find creative ways, creative outlets to enact agency and enact autonomy. Because let's be real, at the end of the day, so many of these pieces of legislation, so many like of these pieces of hate policies and hate discourses really fundamentally limit people's autonomy and agency, and youth are able to say like, well, let's go, let's do this thing. And specifically here, I'm thinking what's coming to mind for me is the Reclaiming All of Me Identity Framework by Hector Adames and Nayeli Chavez Dueñas. And the reason that I'm thinking about that framework is because in that framework, it treats identity and specifically queer, trans, people of color's identities intersectionally. And it treats identity development as an intersectional construct that looks at development of these identities in tandem with one another, as well as sometimes the impacts that social spheres can have on how people might prioritize or deprioritize certain facets of our identities, or even adopt or reject certain stigmas. I mentioned this, and this framework really comes to mind currently because when I think about the resilience and resistance that trans youth enact, I think about the ways that trans youth, and specifically trans youth of color or multiply marginalized trans youth, can sometimes emphasize or de-emphasize certain facets of their identities to be able to finesse and navigate some of these hostile systems. Now, granted, I'm not necessarily saying that it's like okay for this to happen, or that the world that we live in that makes these things a necessity is like okay. Like that's totally not what I'm saying. Here, instead, what I'm saying and what I'm emphasizing is that, look, for all humans, our minds and our bodies love us so much that they will do what they need to do in order to ensure our survival, in order to ensure our joy. And that's the case for trans youth as well. Sometimes what that means is, like, particularly for trans youth of color, sometimes that means really emphasizing their racial identities and really leaning into the brilliant, beautiful pieces that have to do with their races, and perhaps even sometimes connecting with ancestral lineages, aka looking back in time, looking at like what gender looked like pre-colonialism and saying like, wow, this kind of really resonates with me, and just feeling a sense of fulfillment in that, and finding creative ways of enacting that, whether that be through use of fashion, whether that be through experimenting with names, whether that mean praying, sometimes just praying to ancestors or having conversations with ancestors. Now here, what I'm also thinking about, slash, here what I want to emphasize and highlight about what I just mentioned is that I think a lot of what I'm speaking to is about connection to the self as well as connection to others, which is something else that I think trans youth really do brilliantly, is that there is a desire and a capacity for being able to connect with one another, whether that be in person or sometimes virtually. People will go into these online forums or on social media to connect with one another in ways that honestly perhaps previously weren't super available, or weren't really at the forefront because the technology perhaps didn't exist as much. And so folks are able now to use, for example, social media or online spaces to be able to create a sense of community. And so I think I think there was one third thing that was coming to me that I really can't think of right now. But I want to pass off the baton to Annalise, and then if it comes back to me, I'll chime in and mention it.
Yes, please do if it comes back.
Yeah, Sergio, it's going to come back, and whenever it does, just chime in. Thank you for everything you shared. And, before I kind of dive in, I wanted to go back to something that Jody and Paz were kind of referring to. I mean, I think what's going on right now, I usually say, is like brutal. I mean, like we're seeing bans on bathroom access based on assigned sex, even outside of age, right? So that is like something that's really different. I mean, we know shit's been bananas for a long time with bathrooms and who actually gets hurt in bathrooms, but things are escalating at the same time. That backlash is closely connected to elections. And so I do want to just go back to Jody's point around that. There has been a lot of polling data around what will swing elections and what suburban white women, what will get them to vote in a certain direction. It's anti-trans policy, it's anti-critical race policy, and it's anti-abortion. And so I just think we can't say that enough, because there's a lot around voting right now and conversations about voting, limited options, but there's also the world we're living in right now that has been created by a certain group of people who've been planning since the backlash of Black liberation and abolitionist movements post-civil rights. So, I mean, to kind of dive back in from there, if like we know this thing has been planned and plotted for a very long time intersectionally, as Paz was sharing earlier. Young people, as Sergio was saying, they're organizing, they're on the ground, they're on social media, they're on TikTok, they're on YouTube. And that resilience is resistance is part of their lived experience. I mean, you can go back to like 2023 and remember people like Samira, who was a 16-year-old Florida trans girl. That's her identities. And when the Florida Medical Board banned trans youth healthcare, I mean, her appointments were like stopped, and she was one of many of those hundreds of protesters around trans day of visibility that took to the streets across 50 states. So, I think when we pay attention to her story, we know there's a toll that she talked about as well. But there's also that intergenerational lineage. I think Sergio is kind of uplifting that claiming of trans joy. It's not new. It goes back to STAR, which was founded in 1970 by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And, they were constantly working on young people's issues when it came to trans and non-binary as different words, right? Words evolve, words are thrown away, words are discarded, words are invented. And this is all good for the health of our entire queer, trans, and non-binary communities. So I think about the ground that's being broken right now, even as hearts are breaking. And literally, I mean, we haven't brought, 16-year-old Lex, well, non-binary Lex from Oklahoma into our space. And we haven't brought Alex Franco, 21-year-old trans man from Utah who was just murdered. But I think, from what I've done, kind of sitting at the feet of trans and non-binary young people, is just learn there is that drive to live and live, for lack of better words. Maybe I don't want to use these words out loud, but just like vibrantly. That is something I think why older people, like why we have so much adultism, because we want to control that, and it's scary, and it may look really different than what we want it to. But I think the other thing I want to mention is that young people are suing. And so ACLU, Lambda Legal, this is my greatest hope, y'all. And I think it's why we've got to vote. We've got to definitely organize, but these laws are nefarious. They're evil. We know that the legislators aren't looking at our research. They don't give any fucks about that. Sorry, from Bobacha, I have a potty mouth. So sorry, not sorry, but they're suing. And that does take a toll. But the folks who are suing, who I know in the South, approached their caregivers and said, I want to freaking do this. Yes, I have means to get to New York. Yes, I don't have any means to get anywhere because I'm in Mississippi, but I'm going to sue the F out of these folks. And I think it's, again, we've seen that over time. And sometimes I really try not to get depressed about case law and those things, but we do know these things are also legislated in the courts. And I have a strong feeling that we're going to win in the courts. And we've had some success there. And I think the other thing is, when Sergio was talking about that ancestral lineage, I think, whereas my generation, I just turned 54, we kind of figured out to be gender archaeologists eventually. I feel it like it is one of the gifts we've been able to pass down and amplify, that trans and non-binary identities. It's not new. It's not trend. It's not a fad. It doesn't have to go in a pretty freaking box, but that it's this beautiful intergenerational expression in our community. And so I think that leads to just the mutual aid networks we're seeing right now they look really different. I know in the South versus the West, et cetera, but really following the lead of trans and non-binary young people, and just seeing kind of what they're doing and learning. And the last thing I'll mention is that when we studied resilience across resilience as resistance across multiple domains, what we saw with young people, what they said with their own words, is that the ability to self-define and theorize their own gender, thumbs up. Proactive agency and access to supportive educational systems, thumbs up. Many of us don't want to get involved in school boards, et cetera, but we need to be there. Connection to trans and non-binary affirming community, reframing of mental health challenges is actually, I'm talking about stress and anxiety and depression, and I am going to make needing help and support natural, support navigating friends and families. And the threats to resilience as resistance are also kind of predictable. They talked about experiences of adultism, healthcare access challenges, emotional and social isolation, employment discrimination, and that limited access to financial resources, and in their words, gender policing.
I would give you want to jump in, Sergio?
Yes, I did. Annalise, thank you so much for what you shared. First of all, like I feel so excited and so moved, and it helped me remember the thing that I wanted to share, which precisely building off of the thing of like these youth are coming face to face with these systems, and they are doing so in a way that is honestly like incredibly awe-inspiring. And I think in addition to the pieces of like coming face to face with like in political and legislative arenas, I'm also noticing that folks are going up against insurance and using insurance's own policies almost like against them, really getting into the nitty-gritty of what insurance coverage means within medical transition, and then saying like, okay, cool, well, this is your policy. What are you going to do about this? And there have been some critical successes that have happened, at least within the state of Illinois. And um, in adjacent to that, what I'm also aware of is that there are some trans people, and particularly like non-binary folks, who perhaps aren't as invested in medical transition, but are going through the medical transition process so that they can come face to face with these systems, so that they can push against these systems and open the doors wide open for binary trans folks in particular, who would be more interested and invested in medical transition, which that type of coalescence, that type of self and other advocacy is I I lack the words to describe how utterly moving that is.
Right. I can share, I think, a really indicative story about resilience that is at my own institution. At UMass Amherst, we have the oldest LGBTQIA plus floor in the country. It was started in 1992 because of the times our students did not feel safe in the residence halls. We're talking then about LGBT students didn't feel safe in the residence halls. They were having their doors defaced. They were receiving death threats if they were out or known as LGBT living in the halls. And so they pushed Res Life to create a LGBTQ floor. And it was kept secret because students really felt their safety was in jeopardy. And it had a really lot of popularity at first, but as the climate improved on campus and in the country for LGBT students, it became less and less a place that people wanted to live. And about 10, 15 years ago, we really had trouble filling the floor, even opening up to first year students to live there as well. And then 5 years ago, trans and non-binary students took it over, essentially. Found it like this is a place that we can be and have a community. And it's now it's doubled in size, more than doubled in size. We don't have any room for first year students to live there. So we've created several floors and another building for first year trans and non-binary students to live. And it's not because they don't feel safe elsewhere on campus, because we have hundreds and hundreds of trans and non-binary students, and obviously they're not all living in these two places on campus, but it's a place where they have community, where they can be and feel home. And it's been wonderful to see that for students who may not feel a sense of belonging elsewhere on campus, it's a place where they really feel a sense of belonging. And so I think that really shows just how students find a way to survive and to persevere. And also just shows, I think, the importance of having LGBTQ plus community on campuses and having residential space where students can live, where they don't have to worry about who they're living with or living around, have a place where they can pee in peace and not have to worry about gendered bathrooms. So it's really important, I think, for institutions to provide those kind of spaces for students. Let me ask a question that actually comes from one of my student staff. How do you balance serving and researching trans and non-binary people without pathologizing them? And I think, Paz, you were going to start this question.
Sure. I love that question. It's something that as a researcher, I think about all the time. It's central to really everything that I do. And I think that as I've thought about it more, my research has become more and more community participatory and in the way that it's conducted. I think at first I was like, oh, I'm going to do research and I'm going to ask people and I'm going to elevate their voices and center their voices. And I think that's one piece of it, but I think that it goes beyond that. It's allowing community to decide what are the questions that should be asked. I think that when we as psychologists or as professionals, when we're thinking about those questions, we're doing it from these theoretical frameworks that have historically pathologized our community. And so I think allowing and partnering with trans and non-binary folks to really define what are the questions, what are the meaningful questions that need to be done. I think I've moved from doing a lot of really just basic conceptual science to being like, yeah, that's nice. And I got a paper out of it, but like, how does it actually impact lives? And I think right now, in particular, I'm not as interested in doing research that's just conceptual, doing research that that will have impact in that way. And so I think a lot of it is about what are really, as a researcher, thinking about what are our values, what are our ethics, and why we're doing that, and what is our proximity to community, and how do we really leverage the power and the privilege that we have in being researchers to really partner with community to create something that maybe we would have never kind of come up with. I think it requires us to be humble about those questions, about what we might be curious about. That might not be the research that needs to be done. And so it's not an easy answer in terms of this is what you do. I think it's a process. It's an ethic that you really have to have to think about and interrogate why you're doing this research and what the purpose of that is. And it changes all the time, and it's going to change as the culture changes and as your position changes and your own power changes. And so it's something that I think you have to be constantly engaged in. But I love the question, because that's the question that I think every researcher should be asking. Everybody working in community should be asking about everything that we do.
And Jody, I think you're going to weigh into this question as well.
Yeah, I absolutely second all of that. I mean, that's exactly like some of my notes on this were exactly almost verbatim some of those things. So I don't have a ton to add to that, but yeah, just I always think researchers need to think about why you're doing the research. Who does it serve? How will it help? If it's just to, based on your own curiosity, like rethink that. So there's, there's approaches, like research approaches, and I think that's what we're talking about here, but there's also a couple other elements that I might bring into this, if that's okay. Hopefully it's not too far afield. But, I do research on suicidality among trans people. And it actually is a 5-alarm fire. And there's kind of a catch-22 in doing the type of research on the challenges that trans people are experiencing across the country, both in mental and physical health, experiences of discrimination and whatnot. So, so we talk about pathologizing trans people. So we find that there is enormously high prevalence of suicide ideology and suicidal thoughts and behaviors like suicide attempts among trans folks. However, so when we put that research out into the world, it's a call for action to, try to improve the situation. And I have a minority stress perspective, which says that a lot of the health disparities that we see for trans and non-binary folks are, because of minority stress, because of like internalized and external stressors from having being a minority, essentially. and structural stigma, which is a lot of what's happening in this policy space. So the actual structures of our society and how those can be wielded against minorities. So, but the problem is in that research can also be used against the trans community. So that research was used as an argument for why trans people shouldn't be able to serve openly in the military because they have rampant mental health challenges, right? So it's a catch-22. Do we bring to light some of the challenges that the community is having that is a truly alarming problem that we need to address, but then have that out there to be wielded as a weapon against the community too. So it's, to me, could have a chilling effect on the type of research that needs to be done when you realize that it could be wielded as a weapon. But I'm on the, side of more research is better. We need to know, but then we need to figure out, how to address the fact that people would use that for nefarious purposes. So then my next point is just to say that the research space right now is becoming an increasingly contested space. We have people who are disingenuous in their research. There are fake journals where it's like kind of pay for play. There are the state of Florida did a quote unquote study on whether Medicaid should cover gender affirming care. It was done by people who were not, who had a certain bias, right? And who were doing that work to kind of try to get a certain policy goal enacted. And they tried to debunk my research personally. Alon Myers at the Williams Institute, they went after like anybody's research that would support access to gender affirming care and just try to debunk it. It's like, oh, survey methods are inappropriate. I'm like, okay, well, tell the US Census Bureau, like, so they come up with a conclusion saying, that we shouldn't cover gender affirming care. So the research space is being contested. So we think, does it still matter? And I do believe it still matters. Maybe not in state legislatures like Annalise was talking about, but I think it still matters in the courts. I think it still matters for the media. I think it still matters for people who could be swayed by actual facts instead of bias and prejudice. So how do we do research that serves the trans and non-binary population? Well, we have to keep doing it. We have to have the right motivations. We have to engage the community. It needs to be helpful. But it's also in this space, those in the research space, I think need to kind of be aware of the contested research space and how we can have our voices prevail when there are nefarious actors out there.
My next question is for Annalise. There are some great organizations out there fighting for trans and non-binary rights, NCTE, Williams Institute, Land Illegal, Trans Law Center, National Center for Lesbian Rights, ACLU, just a whole host of organizations doing some really fantastic work. But what are some lesser known organizations that we should be supporting?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and I'm still like resonating with what Jody and Paz shared. So I'll try to focus. I mean, number one, I think wherever you are, whatever your favorite local voting rights group is, please fund them. You will know who they are. They'll be the big ones that are attached to like party affiliations, and then there are the folks who are actually registering people. That type of work I learned from sitting at the feet of Representative John Lewis and so many civil rights luminaries in Atlanta and New Orleans. Like, we cannot lose the vote. We can't underestimate the vote. The vote isn't everything. That's not what I'm saying, y'all. But like, people have shed blood, sweat, and tears for this. And so in Louisiana, it's the Power Coalition. When the Supreme Court kind of made Louisiana say, hey, you got to draw a Black congressional district. And Louisiana was doing all its fighting. The Power Coalition is the one that did that. And their intersectional work, I think it goes to what Paz was saying earlier in today's webinar, is so impactful for the work that will happen in the resistance to attacks on trans and non-binary young people. Starting in the South, and I'm going to start in my state. The state now called Louisiana is Louisiana Trans Advocates, led by Peyton Rose Michelle, is incredible. We are in a state right now where everything's red, and so it feels like there's no hope. But I think there is that piece that goes back to what Sergio was saying, like we're living in the in-between times in some ways, and we're living in a time of mutual aid where we get to dream of this world we know we may not ever get to live in. And I think that's what Adrienne Marie Brown says is kind of like why this work feels like science fiction sometimes, but that's what Star and all those folks did for us. And I think you see that in the work of House of Tulip, which is a New Orleans, a based organization. The summer of 2020, when the movement for Black Lives decided that they actually cared about our, queer and trans siblings who were Black, I think, that group was elevated and raised over $1 million that summer. And so when a hurricane happens in New Orleans, they put cash money. They don't put a bus token in someone's hand or a transit card. They put like thousands of dollars in their hands, and they can because they know hotels are going to be gouged, et cetera. They're doing incredible work. Breakout in New Orleans and NOLA Hype, HYPE, are also awesome. I've got to uplift the work of Georgia Safe Schools Coalition. So much of this work, yes, is about voting and suing and mutual aid and all these things. But there are teachers, there are faculty, there are administrators, there are school counselors and psychologists who are in desperate need of support. So I know for many of us who care about liberation and joy and all the things that we would rather dream about, that phrase, safe schools, figure out who it is in your state and support them, because that's where a lot of the pain is. And Solutions Not Punishment Coalition in Atlanta, I think the work they're doing is pretty tremendous in overturning policies in certain districts and winning. And Juan, who was like a huge leader in trans men in that org, just taught me so much about the phrase, like, when we fight, we win. Yes, we've got to rest and all that, but I think sometimes we forget. And that goes back to what I was saying about we're in this kind of weird in-between times. But if you look back at time, we're actually freaking winning. And I feel complicated saying that because people are still dying, but we've got to do both. We've got to hold the beauty and the power of our community, the tragedy and the pain and the heartbreak and the literal loss of lives with the dream time. And so that's where I'll uplift organizations like Trans Youth Resilience Fund out of Philly, those kind of GoFundMes and, Venmo and Cash App accounts where we see individual trans and non-binary folks raising money for initiatives, for surgeries, for everything. Like, please consider giving to those. They're huge sources of mutual aid. And then the last three I want to uplift may seem a little different, but the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, I think, has been doing good work, just kind of providing a foundation for training that's different than what you get in your average kind of psychology training. Beam, Black Emotional and Mental Health Network, please follow them on all the social media channels because they're there. And I think just following the lead of Black trans people is always a good idea in terms of understanding the path that's already been forged that maybe we're forgetting to fund. And then I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I am a dues paying member, the American Psychological Association. Woo, do I have complicated feelings. But I will say I renewed my membership after they passed the policy statement on affirming evidence-based inclusive care for transgender. I wish it said trans, gender diverse. I wish it didn't say that. And non-binary individuals addressing misinformation and the role of psychological practice in science. I think it just really went full on in terms of addressing legislative attacks and what actual science tells us. And again, APA is complicated, but I think our professional orgs, wherever we tend to be in them, I think they're listening at times. I think they see the brutality of what's going on. And we've got folks like Jody and Abby and other folks just doing this policy research work, which is important. But I think that how we train people to support mutual aid and to support young people is really important as well.
Yeah. I would just add to that, that we're seeing a lot of local groups now being formed to help trans and non-binary young people and families with trans and non-binary kids to be able to move from areas that are more hostile to more supportive areas and states, as well as to help those who have moved to be able to establish themselves in a new area. So that's also really some great places to be putting funding. Which sort of brings me to my next question, which is what can CIS supporters do to assist and help empower trans and non-binary young people in so-called hate states that are outlawing their lives, and also in less hostile states that many trans and non-binary young people and their families are fleeing to, if they can, to escape persecution? And I think Sergio is going to start this one.
I'm trying to think of a way to say this in a way that isn't like super flippant or know the law. Familiarize yourself with policy. Let's be real. I think a lot of this horrible, hate-filled legislation, at the end of the day, is actually quite haphazardly and poorly written. Like this is not like good, solid legislation. There's actually quite a few loopholes in so many of these pieces of legislation. Now, this is, again, not to say that there aren't very real world important implications of these policies and of these pieces of legislation coming out. And sometimes the way that this legislation is written makes it so that there are ways to read between the lines within some of this legislation so that we still can operate in a way that is gender affirming and gender validating in ways that we can protect trans and non-binary youth, particularly for those of us who hold positions of power and privilege within our various organizations. One way that we can remain like one way that we can remain protected and remain protected can be to just familiarize oneself with what is actually being asked of us, and to familiarize ourselves with like additional pieces of legislation that could also protect us within the lines of our work or within our scopes of practice. Anecdotally, I'm aware that, for example, in the state of Wisconsin, there is, or at least when I was still living there about a year and a half ago, there was like legislation, there was policy out there that basically said that psychologists within that state had X amount of sessions to be able to see youth, minors under the age of 18. And to be able to see them and to be able to provide a haven, a confidential and private haven for youth. And that is legislation that, if folks are familiar with it, can certainly lean on for being able to provide quality care for trans and non-binary folks. And so I use that example as a means of inviting folks to really be aware and cognizant of what is actually being asked of us as providers or within our respective roles, as well as to be able to, like, I'm not expecting folks to be like lawyers or to be super familiar with everything that is out there. And so in those cases, connecting with other folks who perhaps are more familiar with the law or who are lawyers, who are doing some of that advocacy work, being able to connect with them to figure out creative ways to support trans and non-binary youth, incredible. That being said, it is also important that for those of us who do hold positions of power and where we are advocating for and with trans and non-binary folks and trans and non-binary youth in particular, it's also really important to make sure that the way that we are navigating these spaces and how we are operating in these spaces is like also not inadvertently putting us in situations where we might jeopardize our own like capacity to continue doing this work. I think that it is also a major responsibility, and I would even argue a duty for us to make sure that we can remain in these positions of power so that we can continue to support trans and non-binary youth. And here I'm, specifically thinking about and looking at like folks intersectionally, and I'm thinking about how like for white folks, the repercussions of potentially like protecting or advocating for trans and non-binary youth will necessarily be very different from, for example, Black and brown folks, Black and Indigenous folks, or disabled folks, undocumented folks who are engaging in these similar levels of advocacy. And so here I also want to encourage creativity, not just in terms of the specific approaches that folks take in terms of advocating, but also the loudness with which one engages, because sometimes the absolute best thing that we can do is to navigate quietly and to exist quietly, to advocate a little bit more quietly, and perhaps like smaller, more minute ways, so that we can, remain in these positions. I think that being said, it also feels quite important to it feels quite important to emphasize and to parse apart. And this is, a little call-in, I think, in particular for like light-skinned folks, for like non-Black people of color, that like sometimes for those of us within these communities who are racial or ethnic minorities who are not Black, we can often conflate the difference between safety and comfort. And sometimes we veer a little bit more towards the edge of remaining comfortable and complacent within our positions, and not so much, and like not having an accurate gauge of actual safety. And so here, to echo what Annalise mentioned earlier, listen to Black trans folks, connect with Black trans folks, and certainly it's like really important to make sure that we are using our skin tone privileges, our phenotypic privileges to make sure that we can open doors and bolster and amplify particularly Black and Indigenous trans voices. One final thing that I'll mention, because I know I've been talking for quite a bit now, if nothing else, facilitating connections with other trans folks. Incredible. Do that. Facilitate connections with trans elders, in particular. Turn to trans elders, listen to trans elders as well, and really emphasize a shift into thinking about self and other care. I think there's certainly there can be sometimes an overemphasis on self-advocacy and self-care. And so here, I think sometimes having these conversations with one another and with the trans youth that we are connected to about really thinking about self and other care, and self and other care as a form of creating the kind of world that we are envisioning, and where people don't have to be, well, where people can just exist.
Jennifer, I think you're also going to weigh in on this question.
Sure, thank you. So many wonderful things have been said here that I find myself resonating with. And so thank you to all the panelists for all the great things that you've shared. And I will echo what Annalise had to say about, I do think that this backlash is an indication that we're winning the war, right? That we wouldn't be having this backlash if it wasn't a threat. And 10 years ago, I would have never thought that we would be in this place where trans and non-binary youth would be at the forefront of major national news and policy efforts, even though it's in a very negative way. We are no longer a community existing in the margins, and so that it's hard to remember that sometimes, but I think it's an important piece of what's happening right now. In terms of what as a cis person, as an ally, I can do. So being queer and cis puts me sometimes in different spaces than I might be in if I were trans or if I were not queer. And so the first thing is, I think, for people to make sure everybody knows exactly who you are and where you stand on things. You don't have to be a member of a community to help be an ally, and there are lots of other queer and trans rights that have been won over the years that would never have happened without the support of our allies. And so don't allow the people around you to say things unchallenged, and make sure that everyone in your circle knows exactly who you are and where you stand. And that can include then the broader circle of contacting your legislatures and all the levels of legislators that you have and people in your state government, and just making sure that it's very clear who you are and what you will stand up for. Hold on, I need to pull this forward. In terms of being in a hateful space and what you can be in a hateful space, there's increasing evidence about the importance. I mean, there has been for 20 years evidence about the importance of that one safe adult at school. And if you can be that safe person in a hateful space or in a kind space, but that's an important role to play in people's lives. And if you can be that person, I think that's a really valuable contribution to give. And there's definitely a lot of research to back up the value of that person in people's lives. And then finally, the joining of organizations that can do things. And I would say start with the organizations you already belong to, and then also work with those to take a stronger stand, but also see if there's ways that they can mobilize resources to support. I've been really surprised just being in Minnesota. We have, we've become a sanctuary state. We have a blue state house, we have a blue Senate, we have a blue governor, and we are, our last legislative season was just like a big old euphoric rainbow, right? And so just passing stuff right and left, and it's really exciting. Even here, there's negative stuff getting proposed all the time, and different organizations have really come out of the woodwork to support queer and trans rights, and also to support the migration of people who are coming here. So like local churches are sponsoring families in the same way that churches in Arizona used to sponsor families coming across the border. And so I've just seen a lot of really exciting development happening as people are mobilized to respond in ways that, when things are better, sometimes we can be a bit complacent. And so there is this really big power in the community of response. The other piece I will just say is, I know that it can be easy to feel immobilized because of just how horrible things seem and how awful they are. There are a lot of people carrying this water, and so we don't have to, any one of us, carry it by ourselves. And looking to the other people, like just the other people in this room, are so inspiring that you don't have to do everything yourself. That, we don't need any heroes. We just need like thousands and thousands of helpers. And so I think that's a really important piece of it. I'll save the rest for the next question.
But so that question goes to you, right, Jennifer,
Yes.
which is about gender affirming care and what can people do to educate and advocate around gender affirming care.
Right. So I have a few thoughts about that around gender affirming care. The first one is just educating yourself. I think even people in the field don't always really understand, like, what is puberty suppression? Why do we have it? How long does it last? Why would you do this? How much does it cost? When do gender affirming hormones kick in? When do people start doing that? At what age can people have different kinds of surgeries? So just understanding what gender affirming care even is, because there's so much misinformation out there about what is happening. And it's like, oh yeah, that's not actually what's happening at all. And so understanding that, educating yourself on the state of the science of gender affirming care. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the argument, well, oh, they've never done a randomized control trial. And I just think that's the most ridiculous argument that I've ever heard. You would never do that with somebody's life, you just wouldn't. And plus, we don't need any comparison data because we have decades of comparison data before there was gender affirming care for kids. So we don't need to withhold it from people in order to watch them and see how poorly they respond to not being affirmed. We already know how people who are unaffirmed respond because we have all of the decades of people who didn't have the opportunity to be affirmed to tell us. There's that. Another thing that I think that people in this room and that people who are maybe at this panel can do is getting involved in all this lawsuits. I mean, they can be hard, they're a little bit sucky, but all of those places need briefs written, and they need, someone summarizing the studies and the state of science for them. And, attorneys are not usually trained in social science. And so to the extent that as a social scientist, you can educate attorneys and judges and your legislatures, that's a really valuable contribution that you can make, is to be the interpreter of the data to people who have voices of policy. And then let me just check. And then the last thing is, right, being within your own field. Like, there's probably a lot you can do that's right in front of you. And I would say that's the place to start when you're looking to educate others. I have a position in extension, and so I end up doing, we did workshops on meeting the needs of transgender youth like 5-6 years ago all around Minnesota. And it was shocking the hundreds of people who wanted to come to them and kind of be educated about the support needs that they could do. And it's something that just fit right within my existing work structure. And so there may be things in your own work structure that you can do that really get a lot of education information out there. So thanks.
Great. Well, now I'll turn it over to audience questions. Again, if you want to ask a question, just put it in the Q&A feature. Our first question is this is from Ryan, a former student here at UMass, really sweet person. Glad to see you here, Ryan. What have attempts to introduce and advocate for model legislation to protect trans rights been like? What are the compromises and political strategizing that typically go into such model legislation?
I can speak a little bit with that. I think Minnesota was the first state to pass as a sanctuary state. And honestly, people were primed for that work. It was already, and the legislature was already ready for it. And the minute we had majorities in all the places, people pushed it through. And so I think some of it is being ready and then knowing when you have a chance to pass it, because even here with our sanctuary status, we have 5 or 6 bills introduced every year that try to limit trans rights and try to limit, all kinds of things. So even here we have that, but just being primed and ready for when the moment is right, I think, is one piece of it.
Other folks want to weigh in on this one?
Well, I just think it comes back to funding. I think that, the type, how do I say this? The evil forces that don't want trans and non-binary communities to exist, to live, to thrive, anything. They've been planning for so long, and there is a lot of catch up. And so we do need to fund think tanks and people, researchers you care about. And so I know money isn't a catch-all thing, but I think that we know when we care about these areas, like, we often haven't funded them out of our own pockets and others. I think it goes back to what Sergio was saying about kind of like skin tone privilege and other things. Like, just it comes back to that world we want to build too. Like, how much money do we really need? I mean, there's probably, the way that classism works, like, it just feels like it's a very individual sense of that. And, I want to be very clear that I'm talking from someone who has an administrative position, someone who has a spouse and a house and a car. And when we have those means, we've got to be able to look at our wallet and say, like, how much do we actually need? and how much can we actually give for reparative acts of all types, because we're not taking this money with us. And when we die, and we're all going to die, we just don't know how many breaths we get. And so I think we don't always have these types of conversations, because often when we started this work, we didn't have access to financial and educational privilege, as we know is an issue with trans and non-binary communities. So I think it's just a gut check to really look at, because those pieces of model legislation, they're driven by think tanks that are well funded.
Another question that was asked: what is the role of queer community organizations such as GSAs in the context of states facing discriminatory legislation?
I think
You want to
that
go for it, Jennifer?
I'll give it a stab and then you can. I think that people who are proposing this legislation know how powerful community organizations are. And so one of the first things that they've done is try to limit the access of people to GSAs and to limit their capacity to organize and be in community. What we have now that we didn't have in prior waves of this sorts of onslaught is that we have the internet now in a way that kids can have community. And so many young people say my primary queer community is online. And I think that's a really important way that we can create online spaces of community activism. Community activism is how all of these things move and get passed and get resisted, is through communities.
Well, just, I know in the South, like GSAs have been pretty involved in things like Pride Day at the Capitol. I think, again, many of us might side eye those types of events, but they're so important in terms of like introducing people to the power of voting, what it can mean, who doesn't get to vote, what voter suppression has looked like since the beginning of this country. Founded on indigenous erasure and anti-Black racism in the form of trafficking. So, in that resulting racial hierarchy and caste system. So I think that, I've been really impressed by, sometimes I think it's a little depressing, but I've got to keep an eye on my adultism there. Like, you're like, oh gosh, we're all talking about legislation and all the time. And what about the space for mutual aid, which is always happening. But I have seen this take up a lot of time in GSA meetings, whether they're informally organized or formally recognized within schools. So again, I've seen powerful interventions with school boards, with state legislatures. Again, it doesn't feel like the winning is happening, but sometimes it does. And so I think that's been a really powerful role of GSAs. They're just so much more strategic, especially in places where knowledge has been handed down over time. There's some GSAs that have been around 20 and 30 years now. It's wild to think about. It's not always in the States experiencing the most intense attacks, but sometimes there is some formal or informal kind of network that people rely on.
Anyone else want to jump in here? Another question someone asked: what are good sources of resilience for trans parents and caregivers?
I think a good place to start is the Family Acceptance Project. Just a quick Professor Google search will bring you to that work. It's not the end all be all, but I think across different languages and communities, you will find multiple resources. I do think some of our queer and trans professional orgs have actually done a better job, even HRC. So I think you've had trans and non-binary folks within those orgs, like doing the work. And so I think you'll see the resources kind of be more robust than they were in the past folks like PFLAG, listen, I mean, some of these things, again, in our community, we might be like, eye roll, but I mean, you have trans and non-binary folks, BIPOC folks who have been accessing these spaces and changing the way things are done and finally being listened to, you know, at 50 to 60%, but that's like higher than it was way before. So I can drop some in the chat box.
Awesome. Other folks who want to weigh in on this question? Of course, PFLAG has some good resources. They haven't always been the best when it comes to trans and non-binary understanding, but they still have some, I think, really good resources out there for families that are struggling to accept trans and non-binary youth and looking for ways to support them.
So regarding that question, there's the part where parents are trans and raising children. That's one avenue. The other avenue is parents of trans kids. And so I wasn't sure exactly which way they were aiming, but there are a number of like Transforming Families, Trans Family Network, and then Children of Lesbian and Gays. So there are family-based organizations that where you can find a social network of other families kind of in your circumstances. Whether you're the trans person as a parent or whether you're the parent of a trans person.
Good point, right? Either way.
Either way.
Yeah.
I mean, different sets of needs potentially, but.
Okay, maybe do two more questions here. One question regarding misinformation. Do you have suggestions for how to combat inaccurate representations of research coming from well-intentioned people who want to support trans and non-binary people who might not even know that they're spreading misinformation, and the person gives a example in the question, and I see this. I have for years been pushing back against people that put out there that the average life expectancy for Black trans women is 35 years old. There's absolutely no research on that. Someone made that up basically on some faulty logic, but it gets repeated again and again, oftentimes by well-intentioned people who are looking to show just how dire it is for Black trans women, which is real, but that's just a BS statistic. So what can people do to try to combat misinformation, inaccuracies that are even spread by people who want to be trans supportive?
I'll jump in here. To say at the outset, I don't really have an answer, but because misinformation is so prevalent, and how to stop it is kind of like, I don't know, trying to hold back a tidal wave sometimes with your hands. So like, for instance, a long time ago, we did a study. Gary Gates, my colleague at the Williams Institute at the time, did a study that was one of the first to use nationally representative data to look at the percent of people who identify as LGB. And it was way below the 10% mark that that they essentially, like most of the movement organizations and activists were using, that we were 10% LGB. And it's a different measure, identity versus attraction and whatnot. But that led to a whole big kerfuffle about the 10%, right? There was actually an organization called like the 1 in 10 organization. I forget the name exactly. So I would just say, like, for those of us in the research space, that we need to continue to do the research. And when our research butts up against some of these, really kind of reified ideas about what is going on in our community, or what the you know, what the perceived truth is. If we challenge that even amongst our, you know, our own movement, our own folks, we need to do it. We shouldn't not publish research or hold back on doing research that might challenge some of these prevailing notions. Now, the misinformation from like, and that's like friendly, you know, like within our, you know, our own movement, or people that might, you know, share your policy goals or share your policy perspectives. We had a conference last year at the Williams Institute that focused on misinformation, and I just didn't realize that in the social media space, and in particular, it's largely a conservative, anti-trans, anti-LGBT space, and that there are only just like actually a very few handful of people that are the originators of a lot of the misinformation that flies around the internet. And so, and that the social media spaces are predominantly supporting a conservative viewpoint. So that was shocking to me. It showed me what the challenges are that we have in the online space and the social media space in combating the misinformation. And we just have to continue to do the research and to put the findings out there. Especially if it's going to be something that challenges a prevailing notion.
And I'll ask one last question before we call it a evening, or afternoon, depending upon where you are, I guess. But how do we strengthen the trans underground railroad to provide housing and services, shelter to trans folks who are making a journey from red to blue states, or from more hostile places to more supportive spaces? And I can start answering this question. I know that I'm in Western Mass. We are putting together a welcome guide, a resource for folks who are looking to move to this area or who have moved to this area to be able to settle here and know what resources exist to support trans and non-binary people with various services. Some of that specifically things that are being developed to support folks moving here. Some of it is just existing resources that people may not know about that are for trans and non-binary people. And some of it's just general services that exist that anyone can take advantage of to make it easier for people to be able to find all of this in one place.
I think there's typically some trans-led organization, like in Atlanta, it's THAP, Trans Housing Atlanta project. You know, in New Orleans, House of Tulip, many others. So I think it's such an important question. It goes straight to the heart of mutual aid. And again, a lot of these networks were set up pre-escalation of the legislation we've seen. So I think sometimes you just have to be curious about what's local, like asking people that that are well respected and have been doing this usually for a pretty long time. May have recently become a nonprofit, but mostly we're like doing it out of like, you know, just kind of pulling together what Selwang calls, you know, thick trust networks. So yeah.
I think in addition to trans-oriented organizations, some of our larger corporations and universities have mechanisms to support people moving. And so for instance, like I know that my university and some others in states with more affirming policies have opened their opportunity hire funds to offer positions to people from states who are less affirming, right? And other organizations that may be housed in your state may be also opening funds to move executives or to move, you know, whoever they might be willing to move. So if you have the capacity to ask people in positions of mobilizing money, hey, why don't you hire, you know, what, like, you know, for instance, Target is housed here. So, you know, can we ask Target, like, can you move, offer executives to move, offer employees to move, and help them be relocated here if they're coming out of a state where they're not getting the rights that they need. And so I think that's one thing that we can do in more affirming spaces and to support that movement.
I guess I just want to add one. I love this question and I think it's incredibly important, but I also think as somebody who's just recently made the journey in the opposite direction. And I think one of the research questions I had early on is like, why are people moving? What's motivating them? What are their experiences? But the longer that I'm here, the more I want to ask the question about how can we resource and support the people who aren't able to move? How can we, because that's a really privileged thing to be able to think about moving. And that's not the reality of a lot of people. And so I want to think about, yes, how can we support that? But also what are the resources when Jenny, where you were speaking about creating a welcome guide, I want to be like, how can we in Missouri create a guide for people who are staying that are about like understanding this changing resource rather than just being like, see you later, which a lot of people really are leaving. But I think my questions and the more that I'm talking with people who are here, the more I'm really invested in improving the community and the lives of people who aren't able to leave, who don't want to leave, who are staying here, are thriving here in some cases. So when we're talking about the opposite side of just, yes, this is horrible, but there are people here who are thriving. There are people here who are in community who don't want to lose that community. And how can we mobilize to allow that? And it's not an either or, it's a both and. How can we do both of those things? But I've only been here less than a year, and I feel so invested in what's happening in the community here because they are invested in what's happening here, and they don't want to leave. And so I just wanted to kind of offer that as well. It's an important question, but it's also important to think about the flip side of that as well and the implications for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. At this point, we have to end. I would like to, again, extend my heartfelt thanks to our panelists for being here and for sharing their wisdom, and for Abby for putting this encyclopedia together and giving us the occasion to be here. As I mentioned, those of you who tuned in, as well as anyone who registered for this, will be getting, after this, hopefully tomorrow, a link to the recording, as well as encyclopedia entries from all the wonderful folks here, and an extensive resource list of websites, articles, books that provide more information about trans and non-binary folks. So again, thank you all for being here, and best wishes.
Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists and to everyone for coming. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.